everybody was surprised, but they weren't surprised at the same time because they were just kind of like, oh, typical Picasso.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This week we're going to talk about a famous painter. And you don't have to be interested in painting or an art connoisseur in order to find this very interesting. This is a painter who had a fascinating life. You might say, in some ways, a scandalous life. It's the classic artist story. Yep. I think they aspire to this somehow. But anyway, this is very interesting. It has lots of estate planning implications. A lot of money was involved, and it's a fascinating story. So Marlea, as always, she suggested this topic. She put together the research, and I think you're going to find today's discussion very interesting as well as very educational. Marlea, where should we start talking about this figure, Picasso? Before we start, can you first tell us, let's give credit to some of our resources in putting this together.
Yeah.
Picasso's a complicated figure, and I can tell you there's not much online about the estate. There's a ton of information about his life, but I was surprised, weren't you, that there's very little about his estate itself?
I was too, and I think it's just, like I was telling you, I think it's really funny because a lot of people thought he only lived in the 1800s.
Yeah,
and, he died in 1973, so you think there would be a lot more press about it. But it might have also just been because he died in Europe and it wasn't the U.S., so press looks a little different over there.
And the fact that technically, his life did overlap with the Impressionists, who were mainly in the 1880s, 1890s, and they were gone by 1920, and yet, he lived through that period.
Yeah. So
he stretched through a lot of change in art fashion, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, which is absolutely crazy. I just think it's really fascinating that, he was around when a lot of people that we still know were around, and a lot of people just don't recognize that, and they're like, wait a minute, that's interesting. So I just find him an interesting character overall, and, the impact that his art has had is just wild. He's such a renowned artist.
So let's start by giving a little credit to some of our sources.
Yeah.
We did find a few good articles that we thought were very helpful for our particular purposes today.
Yeah, Vanity Fair had a wonderful one about the Heirs.
Yeah, that was good.
And then PabloPicasso.org had pretty much anything and everything you could ever need.
Yeah. And surprisingly, a lot of the information about what was in his estate after he died. But then we had to go to digging a little bit to get into the more, sordid, can I use that word?
Yeah.
Sordid things relating to after the death and the complications with the family and all those dynamic issues, as well as tax issues, whatnot. So those things we gathered from various sources, but I think that the Vanity Fair article was very good, a lot of research there. Wikipedia had some good information as well. There was also a website that I came across that I thought was very useful, and they had a good show relating to this topic, and I ought to give them credit. Dead Celebrity Podcast. Dead Celebrity Podcast is the name of it. But anyway, so they had done some research and had some useful information regarding our focus today.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
So let's start with a little bit about the story of Picasso, his life story.
Yeah, so he was born in 1881. He was born in Spain. His father was Don Jose, and his mother was Maria. And his father had a really big impact on, the beginning of his art and just kind of how his life went. So his father was an artist himself. He was a painter. He was also a teacher, and he taught at a bunch of renowned art schools. And then he was also also a museum curator. So kind of the whole little trifecta that just kind of built Pablo Picasso up to who he was. And his father and his mother definitely supported their son in all of his paintings. They did have 2 other kids. He did have 2 sisters, and they were, let me double check their names, Lola and Conchita. And Conchita did eventually die. She passed away at the age of 7, I believe, and that impacted Picasso's life a lot too.
Yeah, and he was definitely a prodigy. I mean, a prodigy in the classical sense of the word. He showed the ability to draw at an incredibly young age, and it was such good fortune, I guess good genes too, but good fortune to be born into the home of a father who was able to recognize very early this capability and start from day one nurturing and shaping his education and his life.
I think that made a world of difference for him, because if you think about the typical artist story, their parents don't support them because artists are, quote unquote, always broke. And they're just not fully supported how Picasso was and in the sense that he was. And like you said, his father recognized it from a very young age, and so he definitely just molded him into the artist.
Yeah, the advantages that people have who are born into a situation like that. Your point about most artists, I think of Vincent van Gogh, who his parents really spurned what he was doing, and they thought it was wrong. His mother, to the day she died, and she survived him, she didn't believe her son had any talent. So whenever you grow up in an environment like that, you don't have any nurturing at home those early years. Now, the great artists find themselves somewhere in some way, but it's almost serendipitous, whereas in this case, you have Picasso born into the arms of a family, a father who immediately recognizes the talent and immediately makes his son his project. And I mean that in a positive sense of the word. This is not an example of a dad imposing his will and desires on his son. This is, his son was like a sponge and soaked up all of this training. But his dad even, quite frankly, felt that he had been surpassed by his son by the time the son was 14.
13, 14, and he stopped painting.
Yeah, it was stunning. In other words, he felt that his son had the ability to achieve the goals that the dad never could or would. And there's a part of any dad, I guess, who, of course, is proud of that and they want that. But some dads also, it was their own dream at one time. And so there's this conflicted feeling about the fact that on the one hand, their child has this great, but on the others, it means they will never be that.
Yes, yeah. And I think that all of that his father did, and something that Picasso is just well known for too, is he was famous while he was alive. He wasn't after his death like a lot of larger artists, and they were rediscovered and so on and so forth.
Vincent van Gogh again.
Even like we see in the music industry, they came back, but he was very, very famous when he was alive, and I think that is a lot due to his father and him, not necessarily pushing him, but letting him pursue his career, his dream, and not really holding him back in any sort of way.
Yeah, and lest you think, when you think of Picasso, you lump him with others that you see in modern art today, and you wonder, do they have any real talent? Because you look at what they do and you think, I could have done that.
Yeah.
And I don't, those of us who are not art connoisseurs, I don't consider myself an art connoisseur, but I do enjoy it. And I sometimes have that thought about, Mapplethorpe and some of the modern artists. But I will say this about Picasso is, if you look at his early works, he was first a classical painter, meaning if you look at a shot that we'll put up, what was it called, the First Confession?
It was the First Communion.
First Communion. Look at that shot, and you can see the detail in the fabrics, the folds in the dress of the girls getting her First Communion. Yeah. You can see all that, and it's clear that this is somebody who could paint in the technical sense of the word. He would have done fine in an era of Baroque painting, or Renaissance painting. Yep. He could do that, but he wanted to go to expand beyond that. And of course, he lived in an era that was open to that, and these ideas were in the air. And so he ends up moving from Spain to France.
Yeah, to Barcelona and then to France. And
When he was pretty young, right?
yeah, when he was very young. And I mean, he wasn't just a painter. He was renowned in so many different disciplines. He was a sculptor. He was, he drew. He did all kinds of like different oil paintings. And I know like we think painter, it kind of encompasses them all, but it doesn't. There's like all different types of painters. But yeah, he studied nature like at the very beginning, and that is what he kind of led off his realism with. And then he studied realism while he was in school. And then he kind of had a couple of different periods that we'll talk about. He had that blue period where it was a lot of what he had encountered in Spain and Barcelona. It was, his feelings kind of just reflected in his art. It was a lot of prostitutes that he painted, a lot of homeless people. He was also reflecting on his friend's suicide. And you kind of see this in all of Picasso's paintings, but a lot of his errors have to do with just like pieces of his life. And it's kind of like he's telling us the story through those pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, he went through several periods, several styles of art, and he was revolutionary in all of those. Mostly he's associated with Cubism, and he and Jean Braque,
George Braque.
George Braque, they were the two who are primarily credited with being in the vanguard of this style of art. And when you look at it, it's not apparent what's going on, but I mean, it's very geometric. Yes. It's very mathematical. It has related the idea of deconstructing a painting and then sort of reassembling the parts in a different way. It's a very complicated style of art. It's not, throwing a bucket of paint on a wall, which sometimes some things I've seen, I thought that's what happened, but not with Picasso. So Picasso was just clearly a prodigy and clearly a great painter. And whether you're a fan of classical painting or a follower of the newer stuff. And he also, when he went from that, he went into surrealism too. So he graduated into new styles, and he was often the forerunner in these new styles. And he and Matisse, I guess, both were kind of exploring surrealism at the time. And he's just somebody who was incredibly inventive and imaginative and original, and he also had this unfathomable work ethic. He loved to do what he did, and it's like when he got out of bed in the morning, if he wasn't pursuing or around some woman, that was a big part of his life. We'll talk about that. Produced a few heirs related to the estate. But he was definitely somebody who loved work and produced many thousands, 45,000 works or so was in the final estate, approximately.
I read this quote, just speaking of that somebody said that Picasso's life was basically work, sex, and tobacco. And that was like just the one quote to describe him. I think it was like perfect. But he made tons of pieces. One little fun fact that I found about him was the only person who rivaled him in his time period for the amount of pieces made was Bob Ross. And that's because Bob Ross's paintings were created to be like produced and to get it out to the masses, whereas Picasso, all of his pieces were one of a kind. So he was always making, different things, which 45,000 pieces is ridiculous. That's insane to even think about.
And these were individual pieces of work.
Yeah, they weren't anything similar.
Incidentally, I don't know who Bob Ross is. I'm wondering, did anybody else?
The guy painting on the TV. He the happy trees. And he's got like the big afro.
Oh.
Yes. You want me to show you a picture of him? That'll probably jog your memory.
I think I can get it, but maybe for the few of our listening audience that might be like me and not know who this guy is.
Happy Little Trees is like his saying or something like that. But he painted had like a PBS show for a really long time and taught people how to paint.
Okay.
Yeah, anyone can paint.
So, all right. So don't think of him when you think of Picasso.
Yeah,
anyway, Picasso is just incredibly productive, and it made it really difficult later when they're trying to figure out what is his estate and how do you police the borders of the estate. So he married
twice. two
Okay.
times. So his first wife was Olga. I'm not going to try to pronounce some of their last names because it'll just be really bad. She was a ballet dancer, and he did have a couple affairs while
I suspect more than a couple, but go ahead.
more than a couple. He did have one son with Olga, and his name was Paolo. And then while he was with Olga, he had an affair with Marie Therese, and he had a daughter from that named Maya. And then they divorced, I'm not sure around the year, but they divorced, and a couple years later, he married Jacqueline Roque, and she was like basically Picasso's muse for a really long time.
She was the longest relationship he had?
Yes, yeah. And he just like held her above everything else. And we'll kind of get into how he viewed women, but he held her above everything else. He based a lot of his paintings off of her. He didn't end up actually having any kids with her, though, but he did have an affair during their relationship as well with Francois, and he had Claude and Paloma from that affair. So kind of a ladies' man, not really. A lot of people described him as a womanizer. He didn't really, what I read is he didn't really see women for anything more than their purpose as art, which is kind of odd just thinking about, you know, like if you think of a misogynistic man or a womanizer, they don't see women in that kind of sense, but he wanted to just paint them. He saw a lot of beauty in them, but he didn't really see any other benefits beyond that. So that's kind of why he had so many affairs, because he just was very open with women, and he would go up to them and say, "You're so unique, I want to paint you," and they would just fall in love with him, and then it would just kind of go from there.
Yeah, he, I think you'd have to call him a womanizer.
Yeah.
And he definitely would not meet woke standards.
No.
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 But, you know, he had this charm that it's hard to explain. He definitely had this charm. And he stayed vivacious and energetic.
Yes.
And in addition to being productive, he was able to get out and enjoy life and did. And up until the end, he was 91.
Yeah, he was 91. Yeah, 1881 to 73.
Yeah. So
That's crazy.
yeah, he was blessed with health, and he smoked his whole life.
Oh, yeah. He smoked his entire life. And yeah, he died eventually from, we'll get to this, but from pulmonary embolism, which is basically a heart attack. And I'm assuming it was probably because he smoked his whole life. But
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know
it's
what
hard to
tobacco
know.
looks like back then. My great-grandma could have told me, but
Yeah, well, believe it or not, it was ubiquitous at one time. And he was one of these guys, though, who was very determined to make a place in history. And he really didn't pay, though, a lot of attention to cataloging and keeping great records regarding his works. He would even pay a bar tab with a drawing on a napkin. So you can see the problem for an estate, not to mention world art appraisers and art collectors and auctioneers who, you know, in the aftermath of his life and his productivity are trying to figure out what's real and what's not. You know, there are a lot of fakes, et cetera. So he had this massive collection, though, that he never sold. And so when he died, he had these many thousands of art objects, of canvases and whatnot. And there was such a variety of stuff that he did: paintings, sculptures, etchings, etchings of various sorts, which is an art in itself, and he was really good at it.
he had a bunch of ceramic works. He also had, they consider like sketchbooks, like pieces of art also from any like past artists that have passed away. They obviously, they don't typically sell those, but whenever there's like the pieces left in their collection, they consider them, you know, highly valuable.
Yeah, if it's a great artist.
Yeah.
So he had a number of those. Anyway, so he dies, and he has what will add up to 5 children, and one of whom passes away not long after he died. Yes. So that child, that deceased, ended up having 2 kids that would be grandchildren. So the heirs end up being, after his death in 73.
73, yeah.
And there were 3 surviving children and 2 grandkids, because of that 4th child had passed away. So those are kind of the heirs.
Yeah, and their names, the grandchildren were Marina and Bernard, and the child that passed away was Paolo. So oldest son passed away, but he had 2 children.
Yeah, and the names that you'll be most familiar with among the 3 surviving children are really Maya. She was very active and active.
She's a famous jeweler, very famous jeweler,
yeah,
jewelry designer.
And a philanthropist, too.
Yes, yeah.
She
and passed away in 2022, I believe, also.
A long life.
Yeah, yeah. So not too long ago.
So, and then Claude. Claude also is a name you'll know a lot. Claude really may be the most recognizable name among his children, and he ultimately took over managing the estate. But before we get there, let me fill in a few of the gaps. Though Picasso was born in Spain and spent his first 14, 15 years in Spain in the care of his father, the very nurturing, wonderfully constructive period in his life, still he reached a point where he had to be out of the nest. And so at a very young age, I think he was at most
16,
yeah,
I
16
believe. Yeah.
when he drops out of this wonderful art school his dad had gotten him in Barcelona at that time. So he leaves this wonderful art school to his dad's dismay, and he's been running around, incidentally, with these radical artistic types who I'm sure they were probably Impressionists at that time. This would have been the 1890s.
Yeah.
So they were probably like Impressionists. They were modernists in some sense of the word. And so his dad looked with disapproval, not to mention he wanted him to continue with his education. His dad knew he was going to be great. His dad never questioned the greatness of his son because he knew. But he still thought that it was possible for his son to screw it up. So at this point, of course, not surprisingly, somebody with a strong personality like this, he declares his independence, so to speak, drops out of school, has a few friends. They take off to really the center of the universe when it comes to art at the time, and really the second half of the 19th century.
Yes.
It was in Paris. Paris was far and away the dominant center. I mean, Impressionism was born there. I mean, if you were interested in art at all, you ended up in Paris.
Yeah, I think Paris definitely then was like the equivalent to like how New York is really our like big art area now.
Yeah. Our financial center, even as an analogy.
Yes, that as well.
So he ends up there, and he soaks in the atmosphere there. He meets a lot of these Impressionists.
He's broke. He's very broke.
Yeah, he's dirt broke. Yeah, that's important to mention. He has nothing.
They burned paintings like their works to stay warm at night. Yeah, so instead of selling some, they just burned them.
Yeah, keep in mind, there was no program to sign up for government support. I mean, you either figured out a way to eat or you starved. That was the system that was in place in most of Europe, quite frankly, around this time. So he arrives there. He's sitting in these cafes in Montmartre, which is this. Is it Montmartre? Anyway, yes. It's this area just outside Paris that's it's really a haven of artists, and you would find many of the most famous artists there. And he met Renoir, and he had Renoir tutored him in many ways, but all of them were there. So the point here is that when he moved from Spain to Paris, he fell in love with his country. With France, and particularly with Paris, and in love so much that really he spent the rest of his life there, essentially, leaving occasionally to visit. But even during the time that the Nazis had invaded and the Vichy government was in control, which is more in the southern part of the country, so you had Nazis really running this part of France, he stayed. Now, there's no question Picasso could have gotten out. I mean, at that point, he had fame. I mean, he had become famous by the time he was, let me do the math, by the time he was 30 or so, he was world famous as one of the greats. And immediately Cubism, this wasn't something that, as you said a while ago, it wasn't discovered years later. I mean, he became a star very quickly in his life. And then, of course, he continued to be as he emerged. And of course, the Spanish Civil War that was taking place just before World War II, that was when he painted Guernica, which is about the bombing of this city by the Germans. So in fact, during the Spanish Civil War, which was just in front of World War II, so we're talking about the late 30s, Hitler had decided to assist Franco, and Franco was fighting off this revolution that was trying to take place, largely communist, many would say, or Marxist revolution. But anyway, so Hitler and Mussolini sided with Franco, and they decided also, and Hitler, there are notes to this effect, records that confirm that mainly Hitler saw the opportunity to test his new plane. So it's like a military exercise that they could go and observe how effective their bombing strategies were and whatnot. So that's really all it was for Hitler. But Guernica, which is a city that was on the receiving end of one of these military exercises by the Nazis, was just wiped out. I mean, thousands and thousands of women and children and civilians killed in Guernica. And it was a shocking tragedy, and especially to Picasso. I mean, this was his home, and he knew this area, and he painted this great, great painting. Many would say it's the greatest, called Guernica. And it's in a cubist form, but when you look at it, it's really wowing, and it's massive. I mean, I think it must be.
Yeah, it's huge.
I mean, like 10 feet by 20 feet or something. It's huge paint. And he cranked that out in like 3 hours. Picasso was not a perfectionist in the sense that it took him months to create a work. I mean, there are a lot of those, and we don't have that many paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, for example. Leonardo da Vinci didn't paint that much, in part because he was so perfectionistic about it, and so a lot didn't get done. And so, yeah, we've lost some, but a lot of artists were like that. But the greats charged forward, and they ended up being great, but not necessarily perfect. In part, that was their greatness, that this is what somebody created in the quantity that they did. So Picasso is one of those. I mean, here this Guernica's cranked out in like 48 hours, and it's magnificent. And the thought that went behind, this cubist reconstruction that was taking place in it really captures the horror of this bombing. And Picasso thereafter became, and perhaps was before, but became by proclamation a pacifist. And he was also, I should say, he always tended to be very liberal. He was probably a socialist in his political philosophy. Well, that shouldn't surprise you. I don't know of any conservative artists that I can think of. But anyway, so he ends up, while he was moved by that, and he was troubled by what the Nazis were doing, certainly. If anybody didn't like the Nazis, it was Picasso.
Yeah.
But he stayed in France. He stayed in an area in which it was occupied. He could have gone south to the Vichy government, which technically was not occupied, though they had placed in a puppet government. Still, he stayed where he was, and he continued to paint.
Yeah.
And he was really a loyal patriot of France.
Yeah, and I think he did that a lot of it was just, out of spite, because he was so famous that he was a pacifist, and he could tell people that because he was so famous. People, they listened to him, and he knew that. And I think he just stayed out of spite because he was kind of like, okay, well, you can't do anything to me. Yeah. And I'm going to keep painting these paintings because I don't agree with what you're doing with.
Yeah, you're right. He was defiant.
Yes.
And it's also true that he's so famous. Even Hitler paused before he executed some people.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a good look to pull Picasso out in the street and shoot him like they did so many people. Picasso was too big at that point. Mm-hmm. So I think that theory's right. Yeah. Is he was defiant.
Yes. Very.
And anyway, so the French government and the French people embraced him as their own, even though he's a Spaniard technically, or he's born Spanish. I'm sure at some point he became a French citizen.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people get confused about that as well, because when they think Picasso, they think French art. And they don't realize that actually a lot of his art depicts, Spain and Barcelona, and like you were talking about, the tragedies there and things that he lived in his life there. And so when people see his older works, especially those realism, those classical pieces, they're like, this is weird. This is strange for Picasso. So I'm sure that that's a lot of confusion too.
Yeah. I had to check when I first started. When I first saw his relationship with Spain, that he had been born there and all that, I thought, is that right?
Yes.
And so Picasso, this leads up to his death years later, but clearly at this point, a national treasure of France. Yes. So this was helpful here when it comes to the estate planning. So for reasons that no one can really fathom, Picasso didn't want to do a will. It's not that the subject had never been broached. You can be sure somebody who's accumulating and has in their possession still these thousands of paintings, everyone around him was thinking you should have a will, and including people that had no interest, personal interest. All the advisors. I mean, he dealt with attorneys. He dealt with professionals in all respects. He dealt with professionals financially. He was a good money manager. So he knew, and he made a conscious decision that he didn't want to do it. And so the story goes, those who were closest to him said that his position was that he felt that if he makes a will, it's going to somehow put into motion some not earthly forces. He didn't fear a conspiracy where somebody would kill him, but he felt in some ethereal, spiritual way, I don't know, that somehow doing this act will place into motion this chain of events where he would die sooner.
Very, very superstitious. And but
was he known for being superstitious?
Yeah, but it tracks with, he was an artist. Like artists, they're very spiritual. A lot of them are, and they're very ethereal, like you were talking about. And so I think that everybody was surprised, but they weren't surprised at the same time, because they were just kind of like, oh, typical Picasso.
So because this topic has ended up to be richer than we originally thought when we decided to do this topic, we're going to break this into two parts. So we hope that you enjoyed part one, and that you enjoyed so much that you come back and join us for part two.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.